Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, coming to you on an overcast summer day in the mountains of Utah. As you all know, my new book, In the Shadow of Lightning, has now been out for 2 weeks. If you haven't picked it up yet, I hope that you'll do so. And if you've already finished, please consider leaving a review on Amazon, Goodreads, social media, or on your favorite online bookstore. My guest this week is epic fantasy author Bradley Beaulieu. Brad is known for the Lays of Anuskaya, the Song of the Shattered Sands, and his sci-fi debut Absynthe, under the pseudonym of Brenden P. Bellecourt. Brad and I talk about his early career, how characters change and develop during the writing process, and picking proper nouns and book titles that resonate with the reader without pushing them away. We also talk about Brad's early career and his experience with smaller publishers, as well as his recent stroke and the recovery process. Enjoy my conversation with Bradley Beaulieu. So, Bradley, what have you been up to lately, man? It's been so long since I've gotten to see you.
Yeah, I know it's been a couple of years. I think it was at Gen Con, right? The last time that we saw one another.
I want to say Gen Con, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the last places that I've been to, at all, like writing-wise. Well, at all, period. Not just writing-wise. I just have been holed up like a whole lot of people here in Wisconsin. So, we went through, I think, a fairly typical couple of pandemic years in which luckily I'm writing full time, so I can stay at home. I don't need to go out anywhere. So those habits developed early, because we wanted to protect ourselves here in the house. But the kids, they were away from doing remote schooling. We have 2 kids, a daughter and a son. So they were doing remote schooling for a while, and Joanne was doing teaching assistant for a local school here. And so she was off as well. So everybody was here in the house for a while. And that took some time to get used to, because for me, I cherish the time when I can just be alone and be in the quiet and get my stuff done. I don't like interruptions. They happen and you deal with them. It's just part of the deal. But I get the most done and get the best words out when things are kind of, quiet, and I can get maybe a couple hours in a session. 2.5 hours is my typical session length. So I don't know, it was kind of intense for a while. It was just a change of pace and stuff, and holding up for a long time. And then those habits sort of stick, because we're not really out of the pandemic. I mean, I guess we're shifting towards endemic phase at this point.
Yeah.
But still you want to be careful. The different variants are out there, and we're trying to be careful of our parents as well, outer, more distant family members and that sort of thing. So it's just been a lot of, turtling up at home, staying inside the house, no travel to speak of. But I used to really like going up to, I'm about 30 minutes from Milwaukee. About 15 minutes from Kenosha, where there's some nice lakefront cafes and stuff I like to go to. And so I haven't gone, to either of those very much. Kenosha a little bit because it's closer, but Milwaukee I just haven't been to in a couple of years too. And so it's weird. It's a different flavor just all around. Just personal and writing life both. Because I haven't been to conventions either. I'm just finally going back to Gen Con this year, but I was going to a number of European conventions, 1 or 2 here in the US per year. There was a point where I was doing 5 or 6 a year. And then for the past 2.5 years or whatever, none. So it's weird. It's distancing, right? You start to, disconnect from not, the career. And by that, I mean, the people that you have friendships with. You don't feel like you're part of the business in a way, because you're not meeting with your editors and agents and publishers and just being around it. I miss that stuff, but at the same time, I have now developed this, healthy or not, sense of fear of being out in public and stuff. So that's all there too. So it's been a weird journey, and it's still kind of weird, and yeah, so that's where things are.
Well, and I think I'm in pretty much the same exact situation as you, where it's just that kind of stuff just fell off, and then it just gone, and now I don't know, there's part of me that's trying to get back into the swing of things. I've got lots of stuff planned, and we went to France a month ago for 2 weeks, and we were very excited. It was the first trip for us in 2.5 years. And then we got COVID. Like, it just...
Yeah, I saw that on Twitter and I was like, oh man.
Like, what do you do with that kind of, like, okay, we've been so strict, we're fully vaccinated, we were super safe, we had masks on everywhere we went in public, and then bam, we still got COVID and had to quarantine for 6 days in a French hotel room.
Oh, what a drag. Yeah, that's you were there for Les Imaginales? Was that where you were going?
Yeah, and I ended up having to miss it.
I saw that. Oh, what's such a drag. It's such a fun convention.
Right, it looked gorgeous, and I was like, I was gonna take the long trade ride over there. I was gonna be with Steven Erickson and Ian Esselmont.
Oh gosh,
like this very cool opportunity, and it just cut out from under me on that one, and it was very frustrating. I mean, beyond the being sick part, it was just I not quite the same experience, but just before the pandemic hit, I had been invited to a convention in the south of France, and the name escapes me, but it was a town where I knew somebody. Actually, I went to speak at Oxford. I'm wearing an Oxford shirt. I'm showing Brian. On this trip, I met someone who was running the Oxford science fiction and fantasy club, in essence, that invited me to talk. And anyway, so to her hometown, she's French, and she was studying in England. So we were going to meet up there just to say hi and, get like a tour from, like a local. That would have been awesome. I was so looking forward to it. And then just, getting invited over. I'm a big foodie, so I was just so looking forward to like experiencing more cuisine, because it's right on the border between France and Spain. So it would just be different than what I had tried before. And then, so we were starting to make loose plans. We had sort of picked the dates that I would be flying. And then I wasn't hearing anything. But at the same time, the pandemic news was getting, wider and wider, and people were understanding the severity. And the convention itself finally made the call to call it off completely. So it totally understandable, why they would do it. I'm not angry about it or anything, but I was like, oh man, it would have been so cool to go back. And that was my last opportunity, or I should say most recent opportunity to go over there. And so I miss it. I really liked going over and stuff, and just, doing part writing, part travel, part outreach, and Yeah, I totally love that kind of thing. That it's just, I'm one of those kind of weird people that kind of, I like the weird aspects of travel that a lot of people don't. Like, I like the solitude of being by myself in an airport. Like, there's something I like just watching people walk past. I like it being in my own head. That kind of thing. I like the solitude of doing like a long day where you're doing lots of publicity and stuff, but then you wind up back in your hotel room and you're kind of lonely, but you're also kind of tired, and you're kind of like, you're ready to crash and just like watch some stupid TV for an hour. Like that moment after you've done all the work and you finally get to be alone is like one of my favorite kind of periods of time.
Yeah, I used to work in IT. I worked for IBM for a long time, in a smaller software company before that as a traveling consultant. And so I was a road warrior for a while, for a number of years. And it was at times like 80-90% travel. And it was, I heard this thing that is absolutely true. Like I think it was like sort of an article on the stresses that come with travel. And it wasn't quite what you thought. The stress comes when you're going back home, not when you're leaving. Mm-hmm. Because when you're leaving, you're actually leaving a bunch of responsibilities behind. And you literally cannot work on them. You have other stuff that you're going to be working on, of course, as a consultant. But by and large, I could do those things without a problem. The stresses came when I was like Friday morning or afternoon or whatever, on the way back to the airport, thinking about all the things I had to catch up on that I could not do during the week, Yeah. So kind of in a similar way, like just some of the regular stresses of life fall away from me when I go on any kind of travel, on the outbound, destination flight or whatever. Because you just have to let those things go, and you can't work on them. So you're just kind of looking forward to the journey itself, and then the fun that you'll have there or whatever. So
yeah, it's kind of weird. Everybody, I think, reacts to that kind of thing a little bit differently. I have one friend who just the whole concept of travel, he does not get it. He doesn't like the idea at all. I find that kind of funny. Because I like seeing new things and meeting new people and stuff like that.
So does he do all staycations then?
Pretty much. Like I think that they went to Disney World this summer,
Okay.
And he it was all panic inducing. He probably will listen to this episode, so he can correct me after
Yeah,
the
really.
fact. But yeah, I don't know. I've always enjoyed travel, and I enjoy it more as an adult, because when I was a kid, my parents used to do these long road trips across the country to visit relatives. And we didn't ever really do like Disney World. We didn't do like traditional vacations. We're gonna leave home with a van packed full of shit for 2 months, and we're gonna visit 8 different relatives. And that
Mm,
was like the thing. And I didn't it was always like, packed in the car, vaguely car sick, trying to keep yourself entertained as a kid.
yeah.
And I always kind of hated it because my dad would do this. I wanted to get and, be where my cousins were and, spend time with them. And my dad would do this thing where he'd be like, hey, there's this cool mountain road that I saw on the map. It's like a logging trail. Let's go down that for 8
Right.
hours. And I would be bored out of my skull, rocking in the back of the car, back and forth.
Oh God.
And but now as an adult, I'm in charge of where I'm going and what I'm doing, and I find that sort of like sense of freedom to that.
Yeah.
Even when I'm traveling for work, I can be like, oh well, I've got dinner tonight. Nobody has any expectations for me. I can go find someplace I want to be at. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, for me, travel, beyond say if it's a writing convention or whatever, just doing the writing thing. I really do. I'm a foodie again. I love checking out places that are particular to that, famous in the area, for whatever. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's traditional. I just care that it's like not overproductionized, or some chain, type thing. I want to sort of experience the local cuisine, whether that's inherited from hundreds of years ago or it's some modern infusion of some sort. And I actually, a couple of times, I don't always get a chance to do this, but I do like hooking up with people to cook at their place in some faraway land, because then I get to like pick out ingredients and see what like sort of the shopping experience is like in another place. So I did that in New York one time. Visited Mary Robinette Cole and cooked a meal for her and Rob and Joanne, and that was I don't know, it was just fun. It was just fun going to a local grocery store. It was one of the famous Zabars, I think it's called, which is a pretty famous like deli, I think, Jewish deli slash grocery store slash kitchen equipment type place.
Yeah.
So I just wandered there for a while and stuff, and it was just cool to walk around the city a little bit and do that stuff. So yeah, I enjoy that too.
Oh, that's very fun. See, I don't consider myself a foodie. I love food. I love to eat. I really quite enjoy cooking, but I don't consider myself a foodie because I never want to go the extra mile to find the places and to find the rare ingredients and things like that. But I've always wanted to like vacation or meet up with someone who is like that so that I can experience that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you do all the smoking and stuff and grow some stuff in your backyard and make jams and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, it's all very accessible to, like a middle-class white dude in Utah, right? Like it's not hard. It's not like very far out of my comfort zone.
Well, it's good food. That's what matters.
So yeah, I don't know. I'd love that kind of thing. I mean, like when we were in France, like that was the highlight for me. My wife was all about, the going to the museums and seeing this incredible stuff. And I'm just, give me the food.
Yeah.
Like I get to have a French baguette every single morning. Like that's so cool to me.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Even some of the stuff that we get here that I like that is, French in nature, just pales in comparison so much to what you can get there. One of my favorite things is pain au chocolat, the little croissant with the chocolate inside, right? Or chocolate.
So good.
And so, the easiest place to get it here is at Starbucks. I get it occasionally. It used to, before they used to get their bakery goods from some company out of San Francisco, I think. They eventually bought them and sort of productionized it. So it's worse than it used to be. They used to be okay. But anyway, trying some in France, I was just blown away. Again, going to, decent bakeries over there are like very, very good bakeries over here. So as long as you're at least discerning slightly, they're just really outstanding stuff. So it's fun to get those.
Yeah, I love that. So something that I've teased you about in the past that I absolutely love, light teasing, I want to say. is that your titles and your series names always are kind of a little complicated and strangely evocative. And I really love that because they tend to be different than what you normally get for the very straightforward kind of epic fantasy titles.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but the Lays of Anuskaya.
Anuskaya, yeah.
Anuskaya. The Lays of Anuskaya. Let's see. Oh, I had a bunch saved. Oh, I closed that window. I was gonna read out a bunch of your titles, and then
The Song of the Shattered Sands.
Yeah.
Beneath the Twisted Trees.
That one I liked. There's one that ends with the word made.
Oh, of sand and malice made.
Right, exactly. Like I love these kind of things that you've got these titles that kind of twist a little bit, kind of in the way that you do the wordplay, and you tend to also use a lot of fantasy names in your titles.
Yeah,
and I don't know. I like that. I'm just kind of curious what you do with titles in your own head.
Yeah, that's I agonize over titles a lot. I suppose everybody does this. I don't know. As I'm working on the stories, very rarely they'll come to me quickly. I'll have a little document, a subdocument. I use Scrivener, and I'll just start throwing up terms, that I like, and then start putting actual titles together. And I'll have probably a couple dozen minimum before I sort of figure out, what I want. I've thought about this whole thing over the years and stuff, and I fully cop to this. Like they have been, let's say, one more notch complex than say the typical fantasy title is, and I don't mind that, and I like it. But also, I wonder about that, and also just naming conventions in general. Like in the first series, the Lays of Anuskaya, I think about accessibility a ton now, a lot more than I used to. And so it starts with the title, it starts with the names of the main characters, but it goes through to the names of the places and the magic and all that stuff. And so in the beginning, I was looking for something that felt different and true and deep and complex and rich, and I think I got that. I think I hit the mark. But at the same time, I think that distances the reader somewhat from the read. It becomes just a tiny bit more difficult to get into because some people can't pronounce the names. And so they're just naturally, like, I won't say pushed away, but they can't get as close to the material as maybe they could. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's partly why certain types of stories do better than other types of stories. Assuming that the story and the writing are roughly equal, well, the stuff that we're used to, the names that we're used to, basically in epic fantasy, we're talking about like Western European medieval stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not saying that stories that fall outside of that don't succeed. They do, but sometimes it's despite a bit of a headwind.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they broke past that they succeed wildly because it's just something new and fresh, and that's awesome. But it's also a truism that I think there's, the readership is sort of used to a certain style of story. And the closer something aligns with it, as long as it's bringing something new, the more easy they can sort of digest it. And so kind of swinging back to this whole notion of titles and naming and stuff, I've thought about this a lot. Like, I don't know. You can't tell what effect that had on the readership and whether or not that did distance and prevent maybe a larger readership from adopting the series. But so I wrote the Lays of Anuskaya, which is probably my most complex in terms of this whole discussion. And then the Shattered Sands is kind of an Arabian Nights style fantasy, and so it's probably actually one step closer, to sort of the normal, let's call it, what people are sort of used to in fantasy. And then now I actually shied away from quote unquote traditional fantasy for years because I just didn't want to feel like I was treading the same ground as things I've read. It didn't give me any juice to write stuff like that, and so I kept putting it off, until I'm like, well, I'll do it someday when I find something that I really enjoy and can kind of latch onto. And so now that Shattered Sands is done and out, the 6 plus a prequel book are done, a bunch of novellas. I'm writing something that is sort of Western European based. It has dragons in it. It's a bit more traditional, and my naming is correspondingly like I can't say more mainstream, but like you'll be proud of me. The series title is called The Book of the Holt.
Mm-hmm.
So really simple, right? And the titles, I think I'm going to have one that has like a name that's sort of in world. Ill Winds Over Ancris is the name of the first book. Ancris is a city in this world, and so features heavily in the first book. And some of the characters I have like Rylan and Lorelei and Skylar, Ash, Creed, things that are just more, they are more accessible. No two ways about it. So part of me is curious to see if that will have an effect. It's actually quite similar in complexity to Shattered Sands.
Mm-hmm.
The style that I'm telling it with multiple POVs is quite similar. And, I guess we'll just see how it is. Hopefully I've grown as a writer too. We try to do better each book. We learn as we go along. So I think that will show as well, but I'm curious to see how it goes. But, I'm always trying to find, I guess, something that is, a tiny bit enigmatic in terms of titles. I want it to catch attention without being like, sort of totally off-putting. I want it to be not just enigmatic. I want it to evoke something, in the potential reader's mind to make them go, I wonder what that's about. That's my main goal with titles.
See, I've always really liked that about your titles, because I find that they are I find that evocativeness, it almost lends like a brand to you as an author, because I see a title I'll see a title and my head will go, that's a very Brad Beaulieu kind of title. Like I'll categorize something as a you type thing.
Right.
And I kind of like that. I think that's kind of neat that's a neat approach to try to have that sort of that uniqueness to it.
I think I will just say quickly that I don't know that I did this consciously, but another person who does this extremely well, I think, is Guy Gabriel Kay. His titles are just they're pretty simple, but they're also they just capture something in very short titles, like A Song for Our Bone. It's just great. I just love that.
Yeah, I can see that. In fact, funny enough, I did that with my new book. I tried to have something a little bit different, a little evocative, because for In the Shadow of Lightning. And honestly, I'm still surprised that my editor went for it, because my titles have all been very straightforward epic fantasy titles. And like you were saying, I do have that same sort of slight nerves of, does this put an extra layer of inaccessibility, even a very thin layer, in front of the average reader? And I don't know.
Yeah, that's always tricky. I mean, I like that one because, it obviously ties into the content, but also in the shadow of, right, the lightning. So you have like this light and dark thing going on immediately, just like right in the title. It's right there. So that's actually a pretty cool one, I think.
Well, thank you. I really like it, and I'm glad that it's the title, but I'm still slightly surprised that it made it.
Yeah. And just curious, did that come quickly or not easily at all?
No, not easily at all. It came... my process is very similar to yours in that I just start doing word association. I'll start trying to play with themes and words from those themes and just kind of throw them on a page and combine them and recombine them and all that stuff. But yeah, no, that one took months probably to get finalized. Hours and hours of just throwing words at a page and then staring at those words for the next few weeks as I continue writing, hoping that something new will come to me.
Yeah.
And then I think that one didn't really hit me until I was almost finished with the final draft, or what would become the final version of the book.
And did you have a working title before that? Did you have a different title?
Ooh, I probably did, but I don't remember. I usually don't do working titles. I usually it'll just be book 1, book 2, whatever.
Sure.
And like right now for the sequel, it's just my Scrivener file name is just book 2. So. Hey, Page Break listeners. Brian here, rudely interrupting myself for a bit of a plug. Making a podcast isn't free, and I'm hoping that you enjoy it enough to pitch in a pittance. To do so, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak, where you can toss as little as $3 a month into the tip jar, $5 a month to get the podcast ad-free and early, and $10 a month to hear your name in the credits and feel a smug sense of superiority. You can also buy my books from your favorite retailer or direct from my website. Thanks to everyone who contributes. Now back to me. Do you get much pushback from your editors for your titles?
The only pushback I've ever gotten on any of my titles so far has been when we sold to DAW books here in the U.S. and then we eventually sold to Gollancz in the U.K. And Gollantz's theory at the time was, and maybe still is, I don't know, they wanted simpler titles. And I think that was sort of a thing generally in the UK, is just really short and punchy. So 12 Kings in Sharakai, the first book in the Shattered Sand series, became 12 Kings. Mm-hmm. So, chopping off a couple of words. And we did it, I think, with one other one. But the rest, I think I agonize over them enough, and I do try to make them short, but again, a little bit enigmatic. Anyway, Betsy Wollheim liked them all, and for the most part, Gollancz did too. And they have changed a bit in translation too. The French translation became, instead of the Song of the Shattered Sands, it's the Sharakai series. Yeah. They just say like book 1 of Sharakai, not even the series. So that changes slightly too. But there's so much going on there with so much to consider when you think about translation, because just certain approaches just will not work because the language doesn't translate quite the way you mean it. Mm-hmm. And so you just have to sort of take their instinct and go with it.
Yeah, and it's an argument you're never going to win anyways.
Sure.
Foreign rights are one of those very weird things in our industry because, and I don't think people talk about it enough, how strange foreign rights are, because you literally just you get an email from your agent saying this person wants to pay you money for a signature, essentially. And so you do that. And then you don't hear anything from these people for like 6 years.
Yeah.
And then suddenly maybe you'll get a royalty check for like $8. And you're like, oh, it actually came out. Like, they never sent me a copy. They never asked for my opinions. They didn't do anything. They didn't tell me it was coming out.
Yeah, right.
And that's been, with a few exceptions, that's been predominantly my experience with foreign rights, and it's so bizarre.
Yeah, similar here as well. France has been an exception because it's my books have done okay there, and I got a chance to go over and meet them several times, and so we developed a relationship, and so I was able to keep in touch more than I normally could with other publishers.
Now, on the same thought as naming conventions, I thought this was really interesting. You tweeted something very recently that was about liking a name for a throwaway character so much that character does not become a throwaway anymore.
Yeah.
And I thought that was funny because I do the same thing, and I was curious how you do it, because if I'm throwing a name at the page for a character that is throwaway, and I realize I really like the name once I see it there, usually it doesn't affect the character I'm using. Usually I'll grab that name and I'll say, okay, I'm saving that. I'm going to use that for someone else.
I have certainly done that too. There's times where I find a name. I'm sure you do too. A lot of people do it. A name bank. I develop a bunch of names, and if I'm not using it, I'll throw it into this document, and maybe I'll use it in the future, kind of thing. This series of books, I spent a lot of time. The Sharakai series was a challenge for me because I had to, talking about accessibility again, I had to thread that line, the needle a little bit in terms of making it accessible and not too stereotypical, not too off-putting, meaning complex. Although I have some complex names for sure. And so I was just constantly struggling with, just how far to take that kind of thing. And so I would generally, I came up with a bunch early on, but then as the story grew, I needed more and more characters. And so I would just go through some online resources, a document with some Middle Eastern names in them, and try to make my own, based on those, that sort of thing. This time with the new series, I found a larger document that has Latin, Hebrew, Greek, Italian, Irish names, just a bunch of names. It has at least 1,000, probably several thousand in the document. And I literally scrolled through the entire thing, and it has like the meanings and where they, the derivation, where they came from. So I took a whole bunch and tried to, I have this like Roman style empire a story of the have and have-nots in this new series. And so a bunch of the ruling party are Latin-esque names, and a bunch of the downtrodden people are a different style. They're like more Germanic or Nordic, English, Anglo-Saxon in nature. So I'm trying to sort of split their identity through their names, just to create a subconscious sort of feel to these two people that I'm dealing with in the stories. So I have like a ton of names up front available to me. And so as I was writing the tweet that came up where I found a name that I liked, the name is Maladox. And I have these dragons. There was a dragon rider, and I know I'm giving a spoiler, but people will forget this by the time the book actually comes out. This guy has to die. He is going to be an example of somebody else's cruelty, and it's sort of it's a motivator in a way, but it's an eye awakening for the person who this example is meant for, a daughter of a very cruel woman. And so I was coming up with the names and stuff, and came up with this Maladox, and I'm like, I like him too much. And so I'm like, well, okay, so he could have a brother, couldn't he? Couldn't the brother die? And then the Maladox lives, and I get to like see his pain. And then couldn't he be like, the Hound and Arya type of character, like who helps this young girl kind of make her way through this pretty cruel world that she's sort of coming of age in. And it all just started to click when I started adding a second character. It didn't make a lot of sense emotionally to have like this guy there and gone, and then also correspondingly, like to have this girl doesn't know him, and so his death would mean nothing. And so I wanted to have a character live and to have her see the pain of death, through his eyes in a way. Mm-hmm. I mean, she would be, of course, angry and upset with her mother for being this callous and cruel, but it will have so much more impact if she can feel this man's pain and maybe help him through it. He's this very hardened warrior, and he breaks down because his brother's now gone. They were twins. And there's this whole bonding thing with the dragons that they control. And he also lost a dragon just before this. And so he's lost his bondmate. He's lost his brother. And so this girl is going to help him heal. And so it'll help her grow. It'll help him change. And so just that weird little thing about wanting to keep a character, it's important always to try to find, like, I don't know, reasons for characters to exist, reasons to have them connect to other characters, because it just deepens all of them. I'm only talking about 3 characters, and already, and the 4th one who dies, but it already, just by one of them living, deepens the relationships for those 3 survivors greatly, much more so than if like one person had died that we didn't know, and this girl is sort of lamenting a cipher, essentially. She doesn't know him close enough to have it affect her greatly. And so, yeah, that was an interesting thing, and it sort of touches on, how we approach characters, how we approach relationships, how we approach sympathy in the reader for these people. Mm-hmm. How do we evoke that? And it's through their emotions, and those emotions come from decisions and actions that they take and other people take. And so it was just it was a cool thing that showed up in a place where I was feeling like this, not the story as a whole, but that chapter felt pretty dead to me at the time. So it was actually pretty fortuitous that I want to keep this character came about.
Well, and it's also a good example of how, when you're kind of developing creatively, a single thought will spiral out of control into becoming an entire subplot of your book.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't know if this was going to come up in the talk, but like as I'm working on this, I started this new series with the same idea as The Shattered Sands. I was going to write it with 2 POV characters, period, mm-hmm. and one is from this dark forest with these downtrodden people. One is an inquisitor. He's a thief. One is an inquisitor from the capital city of Ancrus who is hunting him, essentially. And so they get wrapped up in this larger plot that's much bigger than them. And enemies, people who start as enemies become friends. And so first of all, it blew up a lot, and partly because I had a lot of threads going on, and I couldn't tell the tale only through their eyes. I just had to show a bit more from other people's points of view. But also I started in the wrong place, I think. I still haven't gone through. I'm still not done with the first draft, but I thought it was going to be I don't know, a big twist ending type story, and it just didn't work for me at all. It's the story opens with these dual classed cleric wizards on this mountaintop that explodes. And we come to find out that was years in the planning. They did it on purpose. And with the name Ill Winds Over Anchorage, we get the feeling immediately that Anchorage is now in danger. And so a lot of the story became, instead of having some big surprise at the end, it became, why? We sort of know we know the threat anyway. We don't know if they're going to succeed, but we know the threat, but we don't know why. We don't know why they're doing it. And so that's the tease that I put in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And just over and over again, there were so many things that were like you say, just little ideas that came to mind. And how can I leverage that? Or not even how can I leverage it? Like it almost demands to be explained. It has to have like a good sort of grounding in the story itself and help support the story as a whole. So like one example I was just writing today before I got on here, there are these notions of these Stonehenge type places. There's standing stones, henges all over the forest. And come to find out, the ancients knew how to travel from place to place via these henges. And when you go into them, you're in this sort of Endor type forest with these gigantic trees. And they are, I kind of model this off of the colony trees out in, I don't remember if it's Utah or Colorado, but there's like a colony of like 50,000 trees that are supposed to be like one.
Are you talking about is it the aspen?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I live like right next to it. It's like right on this mountain behind me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I thought it was close-ish to your area.
Yeah.
And so these trees are sort of one being in a way, and they both support this travel and are kind of used by the ferrymen who go from place to place. And the main character Lorelei, she's kind of a shy person, even though she's an inquisitor. She's like a fierce searcher for the truth, which sort of led her to this, among other things, to her profession. And she sort of hates being out of control. And she's traveled by these Veerd, they're called Veerda, and she's sensed the forest around her, and it just like freaks her out. And so it became a thing. Like, what is the forest? What is its nature? How does Lorelei relate to it? How does anybody relate to it? How do they use it? And how is she different? And so that's just an example of how things can sort of spin, like crazy. And part of it is really fun. That's like one of the funnest parts of this job, frankly. But like another thing that we must do is like wrangle it. You can't let it get out of control. Otherwise you have a bunch of competing ideas in a story that just don't feel cohesive anymore.
I thought it was interesting what you said about sometimes realizing that you're starting in a story in the wrong spot. Mm. And I did that with the new book. I did that with Promise of Blood as well, my very first book.
Okay.
But in the new book, I conceived of this idea that magic is an industrial resource and it's running out. And my original thought was that the running out bit would work way better as the twist ending of the book, okay. Of the first book.
Okay.
And I played with that for at least a year, trying to make that work. And then the moment I said, okay, screw that, I'm going to bring it all the way to the beginning. And so it's literally like on the back cover copy of the book. It's not a spoiler. It's not secret or anything.
Oh, okay. So you're starting with that.
And so I swung it around and started with it. Okay. And it made the whole thing work perfectly.
Yeah, I attended a writing workshop years ago, and the instructor we were critiquing a story, and I forget the details of the story itself, but it was telegraphing a lot about what the story was going to be, and some of the students, me included, was like, well, maybe you shouldn't, telegraph that so much. But the instructor was like, no, it tells the reader what kind of story this is. If you didn't do that and then sort of surprise them at the very end, they would feel cheated, and sort of robbed of the experience. It wouldn't feel right to them. In my case, I started at a point where this mystery of what's going to happen to the city of Anchorage was totally shrouded, and my thought was, well, the characters will find clues along the way, and I'll show more and more. and they'll fear for the safety of the city. But the trouble was, it just didn't feel imminent enough because nobody knew it was happening. So I either had to introduce sort of like a natural disaster type of element to it, where things were slowly getting more and more haywire, or just completely telegraph it up front, and then again use that as a way to pose different questions. We sort of know the main players right in that first chapter, but again, we don't know their motivations, or why they're doing this. What is their real goal? And that's the mystery that's going to be explained, along with the characters finding this stuff out. But the reader knows. And so it's been a challenge for me because I haven't done I've done this to small degrees with like subplots and stuff, but not as sort of the main through line of the story. And so it's been a challenge to sort of balance. Some of the tension is gone. You can't leverage it because the reader knows what's going on, and so you must focus on those other things. So hopefully you can do a little bit of both. I mean, the characters do have to react and feel pressure about this threat that they now know exists, as they start to learn more and more. But then they have to start to ask, why, and start digging at the real mystery. And so that stuff will eventually spill into, the greater threat that exists and will be shown in books, 2 and 3 and 4 sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, all of that is kind of the balance you walk as an author, especially with these big epic fantasy books, is that you tend to be kind of walking that tightrope of accessibility, as we talked about, but also you want it to be a deep world. You want it to have secrets. You want it to have secrets that don't necessarily feel like surprises. So that when the secret comes out, the reader goes, "Oh, that makes totally sense."
Yeah.
And you're trying to balance all of these things, and it honestly, sometimes it can be incredibly tough to do.
Yeah, it's a super. I mean, and it's a balance that you're constantly working at. I mean, it's for me, and I think this is true of any writer in any book. It's every scene. It's every single scene that you're balancing those things. You're sort of posing a question of, will this character, do this thing? Will they answer the question? Will they defeat their nemesis? Will they get the gal or the guy? Whatever. We have to understand what's coming. And one of my favorite things about that I've learned about writing that was not clear to me in the beginning was this notion of, as we were coming up through school, we are trained, and it becomes ingrained in us to explain things. We have a topic that we've been assigned for some report, whether it's a book report or a science project or whatever, and we're told to explain things in a very logical, stepwise fashion. And narrative fiction is almost the exact opposite. It is the posing of questions and the withholding of answers, and answering them in such a way that new questions are posed. So if you show somebody sneaking into a bank to steal some money, okay, maybe they get the money and maybe they don't, but then where do they bring it afterwards? Maybe they hand it off to somebody and it gets whisked away in a van or something. Okay, now it's bigger than just stealing some money. It's for a purpose. What is that purpose? So now we go on that trail. So it's just this constant posing of questions, answering them, and doing it in such a way, narratively, dramatically, so that new questions arise in the reader's mind. And then you go on to the next scene, and answer that question and pose new ones. Yeah.
No, it's a continuous cycle until you reach that climax and ending. And then sometimes you keep writing more books after that.
Yeah, I know. It's not the end there.
So I was curious about something that it's one of those. It's a little bit more of a businessy thing, and if it's uncomfortable, we can cut this. But I was curious a little bit about the Nightshade book debacle. Mm-hmm. From what I remember, this was your publisher for your first series, and from what I remember, they kind of collapsed and took a bunch of authors and works with them. And I think that you got a hold of your rights, right?
Yeah, so I sold my first trilogy of books through my agent Russ Galen as sort of a follow-on effect, the Paolo Bacigalupi effect. He had come out with a Wind Up Girl through Nightshade Books, and it did phenomenally well. And so they were looking to invest and grow as a young company, which is what you would do. And they certainly had other successes as well, but that was their first just runaway hit. And so it allowed them to sort of branch out and so they had this, I think it was 2012, 11, I forget, 11 or 12, where they had like a New Voices program, they called it, where a whole bunch, Cameron Hurley was another one, and I was in this as well. So the first Lays of Anuskaya book came out at that point. And long story short, they over invested. They gambled too much on new authors. Their hope was by bringing in, I don't know, 25 plus new authors with new books, they would find another Wind Up Girl. Sadly, they didn't. They had some successes along the way, but just nothing of that magnitude. And it costs a lot to keep a publishing house going, even a smallish, medium-sized one like Nightshade. And so they were starting to have money troubles. And by the time we hit the third book, they were at the point where they were not paying some advances, and they had some sort of online rows that sort of became public. And so people kind of knew what was going on by that point. They were not dissolved yet. They hadn't sold yet. And so we approached them, me and my agent, asking, if we agree to drop the advance for the last book, will you put more towards marketing? And essentially the answer came back, okay, we'll lower the advance and we'll do our regular marketing, which was basically nothing at that point. They just didn't have the bandwidth to do it, the money to do it, and there were some somewhat famous confrontations that came up with Nightshade trying to keep certain rights, even though they weren't paying the right amount of money to the authors per the contracts. And by the time it got to me and that last book, I think the wind was out of their sails a little bit, and they kind of saw the writing on the wall. And so they basically said, if Brad doesn't like the deal, not in an angry way, if he doesn't like it, he can have his books back. Yeah. And so I said, I'll take my books back. Right. And so Russ, my agent, was like, well, what are you going to do with them? I mean, for him, Kickstarter, he knew about Kickstarters, of course, but his his main thing is getting books into traditional publishers, getting them on shelves. And by then I had done a couple of Kickstarters, or I think it was just one for like a short story collection, and I was involved in some other ones. And so I'm like, I'll Kickstart it. I'll do it myself and stuff. And so that's what we did eventually. We said, yes, we'll take the rights back. They did give them back without, there was no fight. They had already offered it. So we just accepted. Yeah. And we finally got the letter of reversion. I ran the Kickstarters. And so at that point, I owned the rights. And in the meantime, Nightshade was trying to sell, but they were not an entity. They were not a legal entity at the time. It was a partnership, not an LLC, not a corporation, between Jeremy Lassen and forgetting the other fellow's name. The two guys who ran Nightshade. And so they couldn't sell it as a whole. All they could do was sort of transfer the contract to somebody else and get some money for them. And so that's when everything got really interesting because one more twist, the people that eventually bought them were Skyhorse Publishing. Skyhorse and Start, I think, were sort of two labels under the same umbrella. And so, so they wanted to buy it, but the rights were maybe a little bit too generous, during that era, just before they got in and before things went south. And so they wanted to renegotiate. And so there was a whole bunch of people who were stuck with contracts that Skyhorse wanted to renegotiate that they may or may not have wanted to. And a lot of them didn't because they already had a contract. So why should I renegotiate? Yeah. But then the threat was, well, if you don't agree, if not enough authors agree to this, we are going to walk away from this deal, and you can deal with Nightshade as they are, which was a horrible option as well. So rock in a hard place for a bunch of the authors, and I I escaped this by like a month.
Wow. Yeah, you dodged that bullet like real close.
Yeah, for sure. And oddly enough, my agent again, Russ Galen, he knew the people from Skyhorse, and he eventually sold print only rights to Skyhorse.
Mhm.
So I was sort of back with them, but I kept audio was already sold, but I kept e-rights, and so I had already done the Kickstarters by then, and so I was sort of selling them already. So just having a publisher do print rights felt like the right choice at the time. I don't know if I'd do that deal again, knowing what I know now, because the series was nearing the long, not nearing, it was in the long tail already, and so just at the time, like Amazon didn't have good options for printing physical copies. There weren't a lot of great options outside of like printing them yourself and being a warehouse. And so, then I was like, I don't want to deal with that stuff. It's just it takes too much time per unit to try to deal with all the orders and getting them out. I don't mind doing it on a book release for, a bunch of orders that come in at one time and get them out, but like just on a constant basis, it would be a pain. So,
yeah.
I guess at the time it was the right decision. But somewhat soon thereafter, Amazon started offering the physical sales, print on demand. So that would have been an easier choice in the end, I think, and more lucrative going that way.
So that series, were you pretty much ready to be done with that series at that point? Were you really only planned for 3 books, or did it kill momentum that might have made more?
No, I was ready for that. Sorry, my phone is like, it's Siriing me. It must have heard something that sounded like Siri or something. Hey, Siri. It's going to go again.
I'm not sure I understand.
Shush.
I should start doing that, right? Just drop Hey Siri right in the center of every interview. See if anybody's phones are on.
Or was it? Yeah, so the Lays of Anuskaya. I had by then, sort of towards the tail end of the series, I had written a short story for an anthology called The Spices of Sanandira, and it was a story about these a pair of guys who traveled on these ships that sailed the sand, and I had always wanted to write something in, desert-based fantasy. I had been doing that a little bit in the end of the Lays of Anuskaya series. A good part of book 3 was set in a desert, and just really liked it. I liked the milieu, and so I wrote that novella, and then that became the brainchild for Sharakai. Sanandira became Sharakai. I reimagined a whole bunch of stuff, and that became the new series. And so by then it was partly like I felt like I had told that story, and I didn't have a lot of juice to write anything more about Nikander and Altiana and company. And I really was kind of like, a lot of, I think, what we do, we business stuff comes into play in this decision making, of course, but it's also like your drive to write a particular story. How much juice do you get from it? And that really shows up on the page if you can find something, that does that. And by then I was sort of looking towards that, and I'm like, I really want to write, a larger, at least a trilogy. It was a trilogy in the beginning, but it blew up and became the Shattered Sand series. So yeah, I nothing lost there. I was ready to move on anyway.
Yeah, cool. I was hoping, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your health, because last, I believe it was November, you had a stroke. How are you doing?
Yeah. I'm, knock on wood, very good. So it turned out to be, an arterial dissection, and it was in my carotid, my right carotid going up. It was the part where it passes through the cranium into the brain cavity. And so a dissection is your arteries, your veins have like I think actually like 3 layers, and the 2 outermost ones can rupture in some way, and it can happen from physical trauma, getting hit in the head, sports injury, falling down, what have you. It can also happen spontaneously. And I had and have high blood pressure. Mm-hmm. And like an idiot, during the pandemic, I didn't renew. It was a fairly low dosage that I was taking for high blood pressure medication. I was not taking it. So warning 1 to everybody out there, please listen to your doctors. And so I'm pretty sure that what happened was the dissection was partially caused by high blood pressure.
Yeah.
And so what happens is there's a small tear that forms. And because there's a lot of blood rushing through there, it sort of seeps under that first layer and it can balloon. Essentially, it creates this like little bubble inside of your vein and cuts off blood flow. Luckily, our physiology is such that we have two carotids, and if one is blocked, even 100%, you can still get flow through the other. But with dissections can come blood clots, and that's what happened. That dissection eventually threw off a clot. It got lodged up in the top part of my head somewhere. And I had it was a little bit weird because I had laid down for a nap, and when I woke up, it probably happened while I was sleeping, I suppose. But when I woke up, I was just sort of out of my head. I didn't really know what I was trying to do. I vaguely knew that I wanted to come back here into this, my office and get some writing done. I was napping because I had a headache when I dropped off my daughter at school, and so I came into the office. I sat down, and then by then I was like, things are a little bit weird. I could not think straight. I couldn't put sort of two thoughts together properly. And I remember like sitting down at my keyboard and doing like an Alt Tab type thing, or like, I wanted to do an Alt Tab because I was on one page. I wanted to flip to another window. And I could not get my hand to work. My left hand was affected pretty greatly.
Oh, that's terrifying.
It's hard to remember exactly how it felt and stuff, but I could sort of move my hand onto the keyboard, but my fingers were pretty non-responsive. And so I just could not get it to work. I couldn't find my phone. And this was kind of weird too. I understand it now, but at the time I didn't realize that my phone was in my left pocket, and I had reached into that pocket several times trying to find it, and I couldn't, and took my hand out. I kind of got up and looked around a bunch of times, and then I can't remember if I think I called it via like a voice over IP thing or something. And I heard it ringing. And again, I'm so out of my head, I can't quite piece together where it is. I'm looking on the floor next to me, looking at my desk. I can't find it. And then finally, I sort of look down and pull my pocket open, and I can see it. There's the phone. And it was just an extra symptom of not being able to use the hand properly / feel it properly. I wasn't getting the right feedback. So even though my hand was touching the phone inside of the pocket as I was reaching in, it totally didn't register like I was touching a phone.
Oh man,
it was pretty weird, and so I will divulge here. I said it on Twitter at the time too, because I did like this thread once I got to the hospital. But at the time, not anymore. But I had a voice over IP line, and the connection was such that it did not have 911,
mm-hmm.
and so I wanted to call 911, but I couldn't. I tried, and it just wouldn't go through. And then my wife usually has her phone on, didn't at the time, so it went to voicemail. I called her school, and it also went to voicemail because the head operator was just away from the desk at the time.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I don't know what to do. And so,
that's like panic inducing.
Sort of. But again, I was so really out of my head. I was not thinking clearly. I was together enough that I brought up a webpage and did look up signs of stroke,
mm-hmm.
to try to see, because I knew the signs, and I looked in the mirror in the bathroom, and it wasn't super marked, but I could see a drooping on the left side of my face a little bit.
Yeah.
And, so then I was thinking, well, should I run to a neighbor, which was the right choice. I should have gone to a neighbor and tried to get somebody. But I drove to the hospital, which was dumb looking back, because I didn't know what would have happened on the way there.
Right.
I did, I knew enough. By then it was about 10, 15 minutes in, 10, 12 minutes in. And I knew I had good control of my right hand. I knew my left side was affected, more. And even then I could move my left hand a bit. And so, I got there, and you tell them, certain things, stroke and tingling in my left hand among them, and they will rush you into the, to the emergency room, which they did.
Yeah.
I received good care, and they identified the site of the stroke itself. They identified the dissection in the carotid, and so I'm really fortunate. I mean, I'm 99% back. I still have some oddness in my left hand. I mean, I can use it fully, but it doesn't work quite as quickly as it used to. Some of the feeling in my lips and cheek here, my left cheek, is a little numb. I can feel it, but it's not like it used to be. And so I escaped this incident with relatively very few problems. There was a couple days where when you have a stroke, depending on what symptoms you have, the symptoms that you're experiencing will heighten and lessen depending on the day and depending on how exhausted you are, how exhausted your mind is, how much how your body is physically, that sort of thing. And so there was points where I could barely use my arm. I was like, my hand was sort of like flopping weird. I could not get my fingers to touch at certain points. And when I could get them to touch, it was so odd. Like I had to like look at my fingers and like sort of squint at them. And even then it was like trying super hard to get them to go and meet. And then they wouldn't. And then finally they would. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's something.
That's so strange.
It was really freaky, and the reason, I mean, I can laugh about it now, and even at the time, I was like, oh well, I knew it was serious, of course, but like even then, I was like, it could have been a lot worse, and I was aware that it could recur, it could get worse in the hospital, that kind of thing, but I was just like, you just have to go and trust them and do what they tell you to do, that sort of thing, and yeah. But yeah, after the first like 5 days were pretty weird and concerning. I went through this phase, thankfully short-lived, where I was like, I need to get like a voice dictation program because I'm not going to be able to type properly anymore. My output's going to go way down. And so I researched again. If you fall out of that for a couple of years, there's a whole bunch of new players on the market. So I researched, who's Dragon actually speaking. Apple themselves have a built-in voice translator that's decent, and so I played with that for a while. And but over time, luckily I did go back after 3 months. They give you, I suppose, depending on the injury, but the dissection generally is gonna heal to a fair degree. And so I went for a angiogram. Where they put the scope in through my groin area, and they actually went in with a little microscope. Essentially, it goes through the heart and then up through the carotid. It's just amazing that they can just route it wherever they want to.
Oh, that freaks me out so much. That idea. Oh.
Yeah, it was weird.
It gives me the heebie-jeebies.
And so when you go for that type of angiogram, you must be awake because you have to help them. And so they give you drugs that are similar to colonoscopy. And I've had colonoscopies, and they are such that when they give them to you, you have about 10 seconds. And at the end of those 10 seconds, you are on the other side. You are waking up.
Yeah.
In this case, they have to have your input. They have to have your help. And so they didn't give me as much as they normally would. And so I was conscious. I was talking to them, and so they gave me stuff that made me heat up like crazy. My head and face and neck and stuff. And it was a weird experience for sure.
Oh my God.
And you're also on top of all this stuff. You are strapped to that bed, and your head especially, because they're trying to take pictures of inside of your head, and so they can't have you moving around. And so if you have any amount of claustrophobia, luckily I don't have a tiny degree, but not much. You feel pretty helpless, at that point. And those drugs also help calm those fears, at the same time. So they did the angiogram. They found that the term that they used was the dissection had resolved, meaning it had healed essentially on its own. And they wrote it off as it can be a spontaneous dissection, they call it. And so, in other words, not caused from trauma of some kind. And so he said, the heart specialist, or actually vein specialist, said that he doesn't expect it to occur again. The lining inside of my veins was not such that he felt I was at risk for a recurrence. And so hopefully this is a one-time thing that never happens again. But that's where it stands.
Yeah, hopefully. Man, that is wild. I'm so glad to hear that you are mostly back to normal, because that's scary stuff.
Yeah, it's I don't think about it too much anymore. But again, like the doctor that attended me in the hospital was like, you're a very lucky man. when I went to my GP, he was like, I expected you, after having seen my scans, he said, I expected you to be wheeled in a wheelchair, not sitting up and, talking to me and stuff. And so, it was a close call. And I'm relative and always have been relatively healthy exercise. And so I'm not too worried about that. But I did have high blood pressure, still do. So that, I have to be careful of that. We, I think as writers, sometimes ignore the absolute fact that our bodies directly affect our ability to work and be creative. If you are debilitated in some way, if you're not taking care of yourself, it will not only lower your output, it will lower the quality of your work too. So it's just super important to stay on top of that stuff, treat yourself, and not just physically. I have to touch on mental health as well. We push ourselves in a lot of different directions in terms of expectations and what we're supposed to be doing, how well our books are doing once they're out. And man, you gotta learn to give yourself a break too, because that stuff can really choke your willingness to write, can make you start to write safe, or write in such a way that you are not invested really, in the story and the characters. And that's one thing that I feel really fortunate about. Like, I do get stressed out about my career, and I do look at, other people's successes and wish I was there, and I wonder why I'm not there, that kind of thing. But luckily enough, for whatever reason, when I'm in the story, my favorite thing about writing still is when I can fall into the story. It's just awesome. It's awesome. I love the storytelling aspect of it, making new worlds and new characters and new situations, and being able to sort of, play that out and wring out emotions and make other people feel the same way. It's such a cool thing, that we get to do. Like, I just did a spoiler interview last week in which two French readers had read the series in French, but then they finished in English, because they're both English readers, they're bilingual, and the books weren't all out in French yet. And anyway, it's the first interview of that type I've done ever, where I've gotten to talk about anything beyond book one, or really anything beyond, say, back cover copy of book one.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to give away too many spoilers, and so it was just fun to like let loose and just kind of like fan it up, about the story that I love, essentially. And so we touched on this topic of like, they were like, thank you very much for creating this world. It feels like home, one of them said, and I'm like, thank you too, because this is one of the coolest things about writing in general, is just this notion of like us writers bringing half of the story and you, the reader, bringing the other half of the story, and they meet in the middle somehow. And it's such a cool aspect of it.
Yeah. No, that is very cool. And honestly, that sounds quite like a fun thing to do. I've never done something like that where I just kind of am able to talk about very specific things from the books.
Yeah.
Rather than, kind of the generalizations that you always float around with these kind of things.
Yeah. And even if you go to, like, say, a convention and you end up talking to somebody that likes your work and stuff, very, very often it goes no further than like, I liked your books, and maybe I liked this aspect of it. Maybe a question about a character or something like that, but hardly ever. And I think it just goes to like, I think readers feel like they don't want to like monopolize your time. They don't want to overextend their welcome, kind of thing. Even though we like, I would really love to talk about that stuff,
Yeah.
So this was like, not just from the point of interviews. I have never done this with really anybody, except for maybe like a beta reader here and there, because then because we're talking about like how to make a book 6 better. And you must now talk about, say, the books that came before and that book too.
Yeah.
And so that does happen sometimes, but like not in any other context. And so it was just super duper cool to be able to just geek out for once and just not worry about my own insecurities about the books and just talk about, I invested a decade of my life on these characters, and so it was fun to just kind of talk about them a little bit, and what they went through, both as the person who brought them into being, but also them as people, you know what I mean? And the story itself too. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Very cool. Well, speaking of monopolizing time, I've taken quite a bit of yours so far. So I like to finish each of these episodes up by asking you a very simple left field question. what's the last thing that you ate that just totally blew your mind?
Yeah, luckily I listened to the Veronica Belmont one, but then the Scott Lynch one in full, and so I knew this was coming. And I have two answers. So one is an ingredient, and that is the simple tomato. We have a local gardening center here, and the owner is a huge tomato fan, and he has a garden center, so he sells all kinds of different plants and stuff. But they have a tomato fest, and so they have it must be at least 100, maybe 150, maybe 200 different varieties of tomato. And so then they grow them and sell them in spring. And so each year, not every single year, but for the past 6-7 years, I'll go by and get a couple different varieties and grow them. So I have this year 6 out back, 6 different tomato plants. And it is amazing to me how different homegrown tomatoes especially taste from grocery store tomatoes, because they pick them early. They are hard. They are tasteless. They use varieties that are tailored to being firm and to be able to handle shipping well.
Yeah, transportable.
I think taste is absolutely a second or third consideration, but I think it actually is in the growing of them. It's antithetical to them being firmer, right? The firmer they get, the less they can taste. I think they're actually working on that. But anyway, so that I love doing that. Especially there's some that are the cherry tomatoes. They're super flavorful, really sweet, really bright. Those are awesome. And then in terms of I love cooking, and I have never tried I often say my favorite meal to make is the one I haven't tried before. And recently my sister had an exchange student from Spain. And she's had several over the past bunch of years. And so each time they have one, I try to make a meal from that person's home country just to make them feel a little bit more welcome. And so I had never made paella. And so I got special bombo rice from a certain area of Spain that works incredibly well with paella because it expands but doesn't burst. And so it stays tender instead of sort of crumbling at a certain point, because it's a long cook for the paella. And so anyway, I made that, and she said it turned out like her grandmother's. It reminded her of her grandmother's. So that was a really huge compliment. And I didn't quite nail it. There's a special crust that forms if you do it right. So you get this sort of crunchy golden goodness at the bottom of the rice, along with the more tender rice on top of it. So I'm still working on that part, but the actual flavors are just outstanding. So I love that base recipe, and that's a canvas meal. You can throw chicken, sausage, shrimp, seafood. You can throw anything into it. So that I'm really happy I finally tackled that recipe. It turned out really good.
That sounds very cool.
Yeah,
I love that. Oh man. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, Brad, and I'm so glad to hear that you're doing well.
Yeah, thanks for having me by. I really appreciate it. This was a fun talk.
That was author Bradley Beaulieu. Thanks so much to Brad for taking the time to chat. You can find links to Brad's website and social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. Don't forget that my next epic fantasy, In the Shadow of Lightning, is now out. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review.